This is a presentation of OneLogin training.
Welcome to our OneLogin's Radius course. The intent of this course is to show you how to configure OneLogin's Radius interface. We'll start with an overview of what Radius is and what it is used for. Then we'll actually enable and configure Radius. There are quite a few options you have when configuring the endpoint in terms of how users will log in and authentication protocols that are supported. So we want to make sure you understand what each of these options are as well. Finally, we'll take a look at a couple of options out there when you're trying to test and troubleshoot Radius connections. So first, our Radius overview. We'll be exploring the functionality and configuration options relating to OneLogin's Radius server interface. But before we go into OneLogin's Radius configuration, let's make sure we understand what Radius is. Radius stands for Remote Authentication Dial-In User Service. Use all caps when writing it out. If you use lowercase letters, you're talking about half the diameter of a circle. Radius is a networking protocol that was developed in 1991. Today, Radius is primarily used to control and track user access to network services such as Wi-Fi routers or VPNs. If you log into your work's Wi-Fi or connect to your work's VPN using the same credentials you would use to access other resources, you are most likely using a Radius server. Radius servers can perform both authentication and authorization tasks and are usually configured to communicate on UDP port 1812. First, let's walk through a basic Radius flow. The network device we'll be using for this example is a VPN server. So our flow starts off with a client using their VPN client software to connect to their VPN server. The VPN server is configured to use Radius for authentication. This means that the VPN server is viewed as a Radius client to the Radius server. Before the VPN server reaches out to the Radius server, it needs the user's credentials. Thus, the user is prompted to provide their credentials. As requested, the user provides the credentials to the VPN server, which also, as you remember, is viewed as a Radius client. Now, the VPN server, again Radius client, can send the credentials over to the Radius server. At this point, the user and their credentials are checked against those stored directly in the Radius server's database, or the Radius server has been configured to forward the authentication request to some other authentication directory, such as Active Directory. Those credentials are now either validated or no. If the user's credentials are correct, then the VPN server can let them connect, and of course, if they aren't correct, they will not be allowed to connect. We're going to think happy thoughts and assume that the user's credentials are correct, so the VPN server can grant them access. Here's the full flow, so you can see how all the pieces work together. Now, one of the hardest things to remember when discussing Radius flows is that client-server terminology. The end user has some sort of client software installed, like the VPN client software, and they are to connect to the VPN server. But that VPN server is referred to as a Radius client. It's then connecting to the Radius server. So Radius client isn't running from the user's client machine. It's a role the VPN server, in this case, is running and authenticating against that Radius server. Just make sure you don't get tripped up there. Here, we're seeing the exact same flow, but for Wi-Fi networks. Again, Radius client is the system the end user is trying to authenticate against, in this case, a Wi-Fi router. And again, Radius server could be configured to authenticate the user against an external authentication system, such as Active Directory or even an LDAP server. So, where does OneLogin fit into this whole flow? Well, it takes the place of the Radius server. Instead of the Radius client connecting to a Radius server, it's configured to connect to the OneLogin's Radius server interface. And just as a Radius server can be configured to authenticate a user against an external directory, such as Active Directory or LDAP, so of course can OneLogin be configured to authenticate a user against an external authentication directory if necessary. Now let's take a look at how to set it all up. Enabling OneLogin's Radius server interface is for the most part pretty straightforward. You can create a new Radius server service configuration by going to Authentication, then choosing Radius. You'll see a new configuration button in the upper right-hand corner. When you click on it, you'll see a configuration page like we have here. So first things first, give it a name. The shared secret can be whatever you want it to be. It's a value that you'll provide on the Radius client in order to make sure that the Radius server knows that it can trust who the request is coming from. The IP addresses section is for IP addresses of Radius clients. Remember, Radius clients are systems like VPN servers or Wi-Fi routers, so you're not putting in the IP address of your users' machines. If you only want certain users to be able to use this Radius server service, you can restrict access to those users that belong to a particular OneLogin role, just as you might control access to a certain app connector by assigning users to a role. The login challenge enables a two-step authentication process. We'll look a little bit more at this in a bit. The checkbox there for enabling NT hash for Eat, Peep, or MS Chat v2 enables a more secure connection between OneLogin's Radius server service and the Radius client. Last section is for customizing the attributes a user has to provide in order to authenticate. For example, username is mapped to a user's email address by default. Could map to another user field within OneLogin if you wish. All right, so let's go check out how to set up Radius. All right, so for demo purposes, we're going to be demoing connecting to a quote-unquote internal network, a company network, using VPN server. So what you're looking at right here is actually a system I've remoted into. It's on that internal network. Its IP address, you can see, is 172.168.1.10. So internal network I'm trying to get access, 701.172.1.1, should be able to then say ping this machine or access again any resources on this network once I'm connected via the VPN server. So not connected at the moment, therefore I shouldn't be able to connect to that server at all. My client in this case is going to be my Mac. So I'm on a Mac outside of the company network, and right now I should not be able to contact at all any of the systems on that internal network. In fact, if I try to ping Mr. 172.31.1.10 here, I should get no reply, right? I got no connection to it whatsoever. Now, I do already have a VPN server set up, connected again to that internal network, and it's got an external IP address right over here, 125.191.228. Okay. And internally, it's 172.31.192. Okay, so it's already configured. It is currently set up so that authentication is done locally, meaning that I can only log in with accounts that have been created on the OpenVPN server in this case. So on my Mac, I already have OpenVPN client installed, and we're going to connect. Now again, got to log in with credentials that exist on the OpenVPN server. So we will use just the default admin account here and type in his IP address and click OK. And voila, we are connected. We want to really believe that we are connected. Well, now we should be able to ping that 172.31.1.10 address. So let's try pinging it again. Ping, and voila, we got a reply. Woohoo, I'm connected, I'm connected. Okay, so we know the VPN server works. But right now, again, if our users were going to try to connect, they'd have to have credentials created for them, like manually on the VPN server. And that's not what we want. What we want is for them to be able to, say, log in with their OneLogin credentials. All that beautiful single sign-on kind of thing. So let's go over and configure a Radius endpoint. So we're going to go into the admin UI over here within OneLogin, and I'm going to go to Authentication, and I'm going to click on Radius, and I'm going to say New Configuration, and we will call this OpenVPN. Okay, that's what we're connecting to, so it makes sense. We're going to type in a secret here. This is my secret. I know, it doesn't look really secretive. It's kind of a bad password, but it's really simple for demonstration purposes because I'm less likely to fat finger it. In real life, you'd want a bit of a more complex secret, so some sort of password generator might be helpful along those lines. But for now, this is what we're going to use for demo training-like purposes. And then the only other thing that I need to specify as part of this initial configuration is going to be the IP address of my VPN server, which again, remember, is really the Radius client in this relationship. And I need its public IP address. So that would be, for example, this guy up here that I'm going to copy and paste, because if I try to rely upon my ability to type it in, I am most likely to fat finger it, therefore. All right, so I've copied and pasted the public IP address of the VPN server / Radius client, and I'm going to click Save. So from the OneLogin, that's it. Easy peasy. Now, I do also need to configure the VPN server or the Radius client to know to forward authentication requests to my Radius server interface. So there are configuration steps that I need to do on the VPN server's end. What those steps are will differ depending upon, of course, what that system is. In the case of OpenVPN, I need to go underneath Authentication over here on the left and select Radius. And I need to enter in basically host name for the Radius server endpoint. Now it's the same endpoint in the US. Everybody in the US shard connects to Radius US OneLogin.com. In the EU shard, it would be radius.eu.onelogin.com. And then I need to specify my shared secret. This is the value that we put in over here on the OneLogin Radius configuration page. So I already have those pieces set in here. So now I just need to tell it really to use Radius. So use Radius, please. And please make sure that that is an update. Push to the server. Now I see it says Radius is in use. And if I go over to that general tab, we can actually see local is no longer selected. Radius is now enabled. Okay. So now let's go disconnect again from that VPN server, and we're going to reconnect this time, but this time we're going to put in credentials for our OneLogin account. So I'm going to use my little demo admin guy here, demo.com, and put in his password. Hope I did not fat finger it, and click OK. And voila! We're connected again. Yay! And again, how do I know I'm connected? Well, if I go try to ping that internal server, I get a reply. So we have now configured our VPN server to use the OneLogin Radius server endpoint for authentication. As we mentioned briefly before, OneLogin's Radius server interface gives you the ability to require either a one-step or a two-step authentication process. The one-step login flow is the default, and by default, it requires a user to provide a username value. which we already mentioned is by default mapped to their email address. But you could change this and maybe map to their UPN or SAM account name if you want. The one-step flow can also require users to provide a one-time password or OTP. To do so, you would change the mapping for the password field. So you could map it so instead of password, they have to provide their OTP, or they have to provide password plus OTP. The two-step login flow always prompts the users for OTP after they've provided their username and password. This can be applied to all users that use this Radius interface, or just to those who are required to use OTP as part of their user security policy. Here we can see the options available for the user password attribute. They're actually the same options available for the username attribute. If you're using OneLogin Protect as your authentication factor, you can actually use OneLogin Protect's push notification by mapping the user password attribute to password plus OTP. The push notification would be sent when you're prompted to log in and only type your password in the password field. So if you don't type your password plus the OTP and you just type the password, even though OTP is required as well, that will trigger the push notification to the OneLogin Protect app. But it'll only do so if OneLogin Protect is their default authentication factor. This two-step process means you'll be prompted for an OTP in a second form, like the screenshot in the upper right there. This process will also support OneLogin Protect's push notification. The trick is that when prompted for the OTP, instead of typing in that temporary password, you type the word push, and then that triggers an actual push notification to OneLogin Protect. When the user accepts the push, they'll be allowed in. So connecting these options to how a user might actually experience them is really important. So let's take a look at each of the different options we described. First one is actually what we already saw. We're going to look at the one-step process where that user password is simply matched to their password over in OneLogin. All right, so first let's just review the out-of-the-box default authentication flow here. And we're going to go and log in with just password. So, by the way, again, for one step, when we want to control whether OTP is required or not, basically, and again, additional authentication factor, or even substitute an OTP or one-time password for our regular password, we're going to be modifying this mapping down here. So where it says credentials, user password, you can actually click on that and change what the user password is matched to. And so we've got an OTP option here and a password plus OTP option. So we're going to be playing a little bit with these guys here for these demos, at least for the initial ones. All right, so again, initial default login flow, go click connect. I need to type in my OneLogin username and password. And hope that I did not fat finger it along the way. And voila, I am connected. And of course, we like to prove that by being able to ping our internal system. All right, so we're all good. And that entire default flow we know works. So now we're going to disconnect. And then the next demo, we'll take a look at introducing some of the OTP. Next flow we're going to look at is where we change what the user password is actually mapped to. So we're going to change it to be mapped to just an OTP. All right, so now let's go modify that user password mapping down here. I'm going to select the user password field, and again, first demo we'll try just OTP. So user password is going to match to just an OTP, meaning I do not have to specify my OneLogin password. I'm simply going to provide that one-time password. In this case, that will be provided via OneLogin Protect. And we can actually see, got my phone over here, and down there at the bottom, just timed out, down there at the bottom, it says demonstration, demo admin. I've already added in OneLogin Protect for the demo admin account that I'm using to do these demonstrations. So we're going to use the OTP that's generated by that through OneLogin Protect as our password. So let's go try that out. So I'm going to open up the app here. I'm going to click connect, type in my username because it's still mapped to my username. And again, instead of my OneLogin password here, I want to go and get current OTP. And click, double check it's correct one. There we go. All right. And voila, we're in. Yay! Let's take a look at how to trigger a push notification if we have user password matched to just OTP. All right, so how about instead of having to type in that lovely little one-time password, we use push notification. So OneLogin Protect does support push notification, and if it's the default authentication factor for the user, you can actually use push notification with radius over here. How does that look? Well, it looks kind of different depending upon what username or user password is mapped to. But again, remember currently we've got user password mapped just to OTP. So if I wanted to log in with, let me get my phone view up over here as well. If I wanted to log in with push notification, type in my username as usual. And then for the password, I type in the magic word, push. Literally, that's what I'm typing in, push. So what happens when I type in push instead of the OTP? Well, click on OK. And voila, I get a push notification. Open it up, my face, click accept. And ta-da, I'm in. Now, let's see what it looks like when we match user password to password plus OTP. All right, so now let's go change what user password is matched to one more time. And this time we're going to choose that password plus OTP option. Okay, so now we're going to have to type in our OneLogin password and then basically concatenate it. So immediately afterwards, no spaces in between, type in an OTP. So again, we're going to be using OneLogin Protect. So OTP, here is our VPN client. Let us go and connect. So username, demoadmin@demo.com, password. Now I need current one. Let's just make sure we've got the right one over there. There we go. And 60849. And so let's look at what that looks like. So training, brilliant, really horribly not complex password. Do not use that in real life. And 460849. That is the OTP. Let us click OK. And voila, we are in. Yay! And again, check out how we can trigger that push notification, this time, of course, with user password matched to password plus OTP. So again, here we still have password, user password field matched to password plus OTP, but now we want to trigger the push notification. So the trick here is basically don't type in the OTP. So let's bring up our VPN client and our phone, and let us go and connect. And all we need to type in is going to be our password. That is the password. And we are simply not going to type in the OTP. So by not typing it in, even though it's required, because it is matched to password plus OTP, I'm going to simply click OK. And that is what is going to trigger the push notification necessary for me to accept, and voila, I'm in. Now let's take a look at that two-step flow. All right, so now we're going to check out that two-step process. So we're going to start off though by making sure that we're kind of sort of back at baseline here, where our user password is simply matched to password. So all we need to do is type in password for the initial password field. And then two-step is enabled by saying require OTP as second step. And we're not going to worry about the policies. We're going to just say for anybody using this radius endpoint. So we're going to click save. Set up the requirement. Now, what happens? Well, I go attempt to make my connection, and let's bring up our handy dandy little phone there. And we're going to type in our credential. Oops, that would be the wrong fake domain. And here we have the right password. There we go. And click OK. So now we're getting a pop-up, the second step. So I need to go in, grab OTP, and type it in. And then say send. And voila. All right, so again, idea here is basically that second step is causing, this pop-up to occur. I've got to provide the OTP at that point, and now I am in. And just as we did with the one step, let's check out how to do a push notification with the two-step. So as we did before, we want to see how to use this second step requiring OTP option and OneLogin's push notification. So we are going to go log in. Always making sure I haven't fat fingered, because that's the worst thing to happen as I'm testing this out. Now, remember the magic word. It's push. So just as when we required just OTP for the password doing the one step, and we type push and that triggered a push notification with OneLogin Protect, so too will it work here with the two-step process. So click send and ta-da! Up pops my push notification. I go in and accept, and ta-da, I'm in. So we talked a lot about how you can use OneLogin Protect as your additional authentication factor. But the fact is, OneLogin actually supports a lot of different authentication factors. So here we can see that, in fact, most authentication factors are supported across the different login flows. There are, however, a few notable differences. For example, security questions. No security questions, not supported at all. Forget it, they won't work. And something to note there, MSChap v2, okay, will not work for any of the OTP MFA type options here at all. So if you are using one of the authentication protocols involving MSChap v2, the only way that you can enable MFA is if you do that match user password field to password plus OTP, and then just do the type in the password. So when prompted, type in username and then type in password in the password box, leaving that OTP portion of what is required blank, thus triggering a push notification from OneLogin Protect. So that push notification, of course, has its other fun little pieces, like if you wanted it to be triggered and it was an OTP kind of option only, then you type in the word push. So there are a few tricks to using that OneLogin Protect push functionality. And in fact, it is the only one in a particular configuration there, that one-step login password plus OTP option there, that will support the MSChap v2 authentication protocol. Since we mentioned them, we should probably talk about them. The Radius authentication protocols that are supported by OneLogin's Radius implementation. So, 3 main options we have for authentication protocols when it comes to Radius. PAP, or Password Authentication Protocol, EAP-PAP, basically, or the EAP-PEEP MSCHAP v2 option there. So PAP is considered to be the weakest. Okay, it's vulnerable to attack and basically doesn't encrypt the passwords very well, so they're very, very vulnerable. That means if you are implementing a PAP-only option, as far as the authentication protocol is concerned, you really want to incorporate MFA somehow. So use that one-step login with username OTP, or the username with, password plus OTP, or even go and require the 2-step. Okay, anything along those lines. So when you're doing PAP, really, really must bundle it up with MFA requirement. Basic flow here looks like this, right? User is going to initiate that connection from their to the network service. Network service then is going to request the client's credentials. Again, the user is requesting it, starting off this sort of PAP communication. User then sends in the credentials, and the credentials are sent over to, in this case, OneLogin's Radius server. Obviously, OneLogin is going to accept or reject it, depending upon whether the credentials are correct or not. And we go all the way back through. If they're rejected, obviously, again, asking for new credentials. But key here is really not requiring any sort of encryption. Thus, PAP, not the best secure option. So, what's an alternative? Well, one step up is what, in a really long way, we can call EAP-TTLS PAP. So EAP stands for Extensible Authentication Protocol, and that TTLS portion of it is the Tunnel Transport Layer Security. So this is requiring a secure connection. How does this get established? Well, when the initial communication starts up, basically they're saying, hey, do you speak EAP-PAP? And if the service says yes, then the rest of the communication will be encrypted. Now, the trick here is that depending upon the NAS device, so the Wi-Fi router or the VPN server, etc., okay, it might be necessary to actually install certificates on the clients themselves, those Radius clients. So again, this all depends upon the device, but it is something to be aware of. For security reasons, we rotate those certificates every year, okay, following security best practices. So that means you need to make it part of your maintenance plan to ensure that you have the most up-to-date certificate. And of course, when you're setting this up, you'll want the most up-to-date certificates. Easiest way to find the most up-to-date certificates, just search for Radius Client Certs at support1login.com, and they are listed based upon the year that they were rolled out. And here we can actually see, so this is a Wireshark trace of a conversation, basically where they're negotiating, hey, do you speak EAP? And so we can see this one is the access request, asking to see, hey, can you use or speak the extensible authentication protocol down there? And request response, the access challenge comes back, yes, I can speak the extensible authentication protocol. The third option is the EAP-PEEP MSCHAP v2. So we still got the extensible authentication protocol, and then we put in here protected extensible authentication protocol, thus PEEP. So instead of the TTLS, we've got PEEP. And we're adding on top of this the Microsoft Challenge handshake piece, basically trying to ensure that the communication hasn't been hijacked along the way. Only thing that you have to do on the OneLogin end in order to make sure that this will work, again, there's some configuration steps that you have to do over on the NAS device end, again, those VPN servers or those Wi-Fi routers. But on the OneLogin end, one simple step, make sure that enable NT hash for EPEEP MS Chat v2 is checked. And remember, we mentioned this before, because of the way MS Chat v2 works, the only MFA options that work with MS Chat v2 is that OneLogin Protect push option if you have mapped password to password plus OTP. So, how does this flow look? It's just a little bit chattier, okay? I've got a few extra steps there that are going on between the Radius client and OneLogin, the Radius server. Basically, again, that sort of challenge response process to make sure that request is coming from the same person who initiated the request, same Radius. To finish off, we want to mention a few tools out there that can help you test your Radius configurations. So, 3 popular tools or possibilities are Wireshark, pretty popular. We've seen a couple of traces from Wireshark, useful kind of tool. And RadLogin is another one, a little more command-like type utility. And NTRadPing, which is actually a free download for Windows and really, really easy to use. So not a lot of chatter. Also not a whole bunch of feedback that I'm going to get. Wireshark's really going to tell me what's going on under the hood. But NTRadPing is really nice when you're initially setting up your Radius server interface over on OneLogin, because you can test out like, hey, can a Radius client even connect to it the way that I've configured it by using NTRadPing. So installs on a Windows server. You configure the Radius server host, setting there. That's that Radius US, OneLogin.com, or could be Radius EU, OneLogin.com if you were in the EU shard. Port is 1812. We did mention that earlier in this course. Retry, you can change those. The secret is whatever you've configured for your Radius configuration, and then username and password. So just put in all the information, click on send there, and you'll see what the reply is. Was it successful or not? Nice, easy test interface. Did I just configure this thing correctly before you go through the hassle of reconfiguring your entire NAS device? That is the end of configuring OneLogin's Radius server interface.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.